Now, John 6:68 is one of my favorite Bible verses. It's something that I can relate to. It somewhat reflects my own spiritual journey. Vast crowds that had been following Jesus then suddenly turned away from him. And so Jesus turned to his own 12 disciples and asked them, "Are you too going to leave?" And Peter, the spokesman of the group, famously said, "Lord, who else would we turn to? Only you have the words to eternal life." So, what led up to that point? Why did Peter say that? Well, here's the background story. Now, Peter's confession comes at the end of chapter 6, which is a long chapter. It has 71 verses. The chapter begins, though, with vast crowds, thousands of people flocking to hear Jesus preach because of all the miracles he had been performing. And they were so excited, so enthralled, that no one seemed to have bothered to pack a lunch except a young boy with basically a few dinner rolls and a couple fish. And yet with that, Jesus performed one of his greatest miracles. It's the only miracle other than the resurrection, I believe, that's mentioned in all four Gospels. I could be wrong. If you can think of any other miracle that's mentioned in all four Gospels, let me know in the comment section below. Anyway, with that meager amount of food, Jesus fed thousands of people. Now that sent the crowds absolutely wild. They were convinced that Jesus must be the prophet whom Moses had spoken about. A common view was that when this prophet, this Messiah would appear, he would renew the whole cycle of God sending manna, sending food down from heaven to feed his people, just as what happened under Moses in the desert wanderings. And so John's gospel says that the people, they were wanting to take Jesus by force and make him their king. But Jesus caught wind of what they were doing. He made himself scarce. And then when it was nightfall, he and his disciples sailed across to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. Now, at daybreak, when the crowds realized what Jesus had done, the more zealous amongst them got into boats and sailed across the other side in hot pursuit. Now, by any natural metrics, by any natural measurement, you would think that those would be the most committed people of all. Those would be the kind of people whom Jesus would want as followers. And yet, that proved not to be the case. To make a long story short, in spite of their zealousness, they only wanted to have their bellies filled. They were only after having their material needs met. They weren't the least bit interested in having their spiritual needs met. And when they found out what Jesus was really all about, they were like, we don't want this. And so they left Jesus en masse. And that's when Jesus turned to his 12 disciples and asked them if they wanted to leave too. Now, Peter's confession has always struck a chord with me. Throughout my Christian walk, I've had plenty of doubts, I've had plenty of questions. And yet I always seem to return back to Peter's response. Who else would I turn to? What else would I turn to? It was about 20 years ago when I went so far as to completely abandon the Christian faith. I went so far as to stop believing in God. I went through a period of deconstruction before that was even a thing. Now, for those of you who may not know, deconstruction is a buzzword currently. It seems that a month doesn't go by without hearing about some leading Christian figure or leader who's gone through a period of deconstruction and no longer holds to the tenets of the Christian faith, but instead have usually embraced some ill-defined, airy-fairy, touchy-feely form of spirituality. Now, there's certainly nothing wrong with having questions about your faith. In fact, I think it can be healthy in many situations. That being said, however, I find that the logic behind so many of these deconstruction testimonials that you'll find on social media to be rather wanting. I find so many of them make the fatal debater's mistake in assuming that because one can allegedly disprove your opponent's position, that somehow automatically makes yours right, when in fact, you both could be wrong. Perhaps not the greatest analogy, but it would be sort of like someone claiming that they no longer believe that the Earth is hollow, but instead have embraced a flat Earth theory. Again, maybe not the greatest example, but I find so many of these deconstruction testimonials on social media. People who've spent so much time deconstructing their Christian faith, but then don't apply the same vigor, the same skepticism in what alternative that they're now embracing. Well, 20 years ago, I deconstructed my alternative position. I applied the same skepticism, the same doubt, the same intellectual vigor as I did when I was questioning Christianity. And I found my alternative position to be wanting, and so I returned back to the faith. Now, that certainly doesn't mean I still don't have doubts, I still don't have questions, I do. But I find myself agreeing with Peter more and more. Lord, who else is there to turn to? Only you have the words to eternal life. Now, I'd really appreciate it if you would tell your friends at church about this YouTube channel. That would make me really happy. God's peace.